What up? Reverend Brian Akers here, and this is It's Really Real. And today we're having a conversation with Reverend Amanda Ganley. She is the poly priestess. She is serving a new thought ministry of sex positivity. And so this one's going to be fun, guys. So Amanda, tell them what they should know about you before we start chatting.
Cool. Hi, Brian. Thanks. Yeah, so I've been podcasting for the last year with Poly Priestess, and the podcast is about love and relationship as spiritual practice. And I guest speak when there are communities. Mostly it's been all over Southern California and Central New Mexico, but now that we are, most of us, predominantly online, some really cool opportunities are coming up to speak all over the country, which is really awesome.
Well, you're going to be speaking in my backyard this Sunday. You're going to be over, the Greater Baltimore Church has you. Shout out to Reverend Raymond and the Greater Baltimore CSL up there. Woo.
Awesome. And thanks for inviting me, Raymond, and CSL Greater Baltimore. So I'm excited for that. And and I guess that's predominantly what I'd love to talk about is love and relationship and how we can create authentic space for people to be themselves and be honored for who they are in all the ways that we are practicing love and connection in our lives.
Well, I think that's like what piques my interest the most, right? So, I mean, this isn't some aging audience that is like sitting in a bunch of pews in a traditional church space, right? And the title of the project is It's Really Real. So like I would love to just skip all of the preamble and dive deep into like the most unadulterated like way that we can discuss it. So I just want to invite you to like feel like the audience that I'm building is one that's going to want to hear like all the raw dog stuff. So let's start with, what is sex positivity? Like, what does that even mean? And why have you chosen to really take that up as a main focus of your ministry?
Cool. So in all honesty, like even speaking to the aging people who are sitting in pews, sex positivity has its roots from the sexual liberation movement of the 60s, right? So just like any other movement has had to change over time, like the civil rights movement, we're seeing that the civil rights movement of the 60s is not the civil rights movement that we're having now. So sex positivity, sexual liberation also had to evolve over time and has evolved into what you hear most often as sex positive. And that really began by a movement in 2009. There was a group in Portland called Sexual Positive Worldwide or something. And they have local chapters everywhere promoting this idea, which is sexual positivity, which is understanding that consensual acts among adults are healthy and fulfilling. And we don't need to shame other people for these practices, especially based on our spiritual beliefs, right? But for any reason. So honoring that path that everyone just is expressing themselves and exploring, and everything is consensual and it's all good.
So what made you think, boy, spiritual people need to be learning about and understanding these concepts?
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing for me has been a path of authenticity. So when I began my training as a practitioner and going through ministerial school, we kept talking about how important it is to be authentic and to honor everyone's path to the one. And sexual exploration is part of the path to the one for so many of us. And when we just sort of wanted to lock that in a closet and pretend like it wasn't a part of our spirituality, I think we were cutting ourselves off from a huge part of the conversation. And it's not valid anymore to say that those things are separate. Our bodies and our pleasure are not a separate experience from our spiritual experience. And if we're going to talk about who we are as authentic human beings, then pleasure and sex are a part of those authentic experiences as spiritual beings as well as human beings.
So how's that been received by the communities that you've been trying to express your ministry through?
Well, I've mostly been doing that online, and I do have a social media presence under Rev Amanda Ganley and Poly Priestess, and I would say that the traditional community will not follow Poly Priestess because I'm talking about sex and I'm talking about relationship diversity, so I do talk about ethical non-monogamy as a valid relationship choice in addition to monogamy as a valid.
Okay, hold on. Okay, for the dumb folks.
Yeah.
Ethical non-monogamy, go.
Okay, so ethical non-monogamy is a large umbrella term that describes everyone who is practicing consensual or ethical non-monogamy, which means like, you know, we're not in our 20s. We're not just fooling around with everybody and pretending like we're not doing it. We're actually having open communication with our partners about the ways that we are practicing love and sex and relationship. And so that can mean people who are swingers, that can mean people who are in open relationships, people who are polyamorous, relationship anarchists, solo poly. There's a whole lot of things under that
Whoa,
umbrella.
solo poly and relation anarchist just blew my mind. Like I'm
Those
dying
are
to
like
know,
next level. We'd have to do a whole other episode on just those things. Or you
I
can check
don't think for a second that we might not, because those
We
two
might.
terms alone make me want to do those episodes.
And you can totally also check out the Poly Priestess podcast, which goes into those things, because I
Okay.
actually identify mostly as relationship anarchist at this point.
Okay.
So all of those, ethical non-monogamy is the large umbrella term that defines all of the ways that people are practicing what we commonly would call open relationships. But there's just a wide variety of relationship style under that umbrella.
Okay. So there's like there's some kind of relationship that is very interesting to me, which is the idea of sexuality and identity.
Right.
And a lot right now in all movements revolving around identity, we're experiencing a huge learning curve, especially for dumb white dudes, right? One of the things that I've always held for myself, and I don't consider myself to be just a heterosexual male, although I think that I move through the world as a perceivedly heterosexual male. But when I think about the sexuality, for me, sexuality is behavioral and not identity driven.
Right.
And so it's hard for me because I don't think that there will come a time when someone will describe my sexuality through an identity title or statement or name, because I believe it's behavior, not identity. What do you feel about the relationship between identity and sexual behavior? And I don't know. I'm interested in what you think about that dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we are sort of opposite ends of the same coin, though. Like, we both identify as cis-het people. So when you're seeing CIS-HET on and anywhere, if you're reading it, that's cis-hetero. And what cis means is that we are presenting as like the stereotypical version of that gender. So you're the white guy and you present as hetero, and I present as a very feminine woman. And so those things are really identity driven because it's how the world sees us. And I do think that we have an entire generation of folks right now who are Gen Z who are having a deeper conversation about how they identify with the world in terms of their sexuality. So now we're starting to see a whole lot of flags and a whole lot of terms like asexual and queer and people who are exploring that part of their identity. And I think that it's just really important also when we're still talking about this path to authenticity, the way that we show up in the world, the way that we experience love and affection and sex, those things are a part of our identity. And when we understand for how many generations we've been telling people you have to fit into these little boxes, and now we have entire generations of folks who are like, I don't fit in that box. And I feel like there gets to be a space where I am okay not fitting in that box anymore and talking about it. And when we talk about that just in spiritual circles, right, if we as spiritual people and spiritual leaders want to create space for people to feel safe in their bodies and in their identity, then it is opening the door to that conversation and hearing what people's actual lived experiences around their sexuality and their identity and where those things overlap.
Well, I think that's what's challenging for me, right? Because you're only viewing the world through your own lens. And so for me, my lens is sexuality is a coin flip. There's too many variables that determine whether you do or do not engage in sexual content with another human being. And so for me, it's like anybody who says what they're going to do or who they would be in certain circumstances that have never been in those circumstances can't be trusted, because you don't actually know what you would do in any given circumstance until you're in that circumstance from a behavioral standpoint, in my personal opinion. Was that somebody cracked a joke at me the other day that was like, hey, we all swing both ways, right? And I was like, well, yeah, you never, like, you can't tell what all the variables are. So, but it's not about sex specifically, right? Sex positivity itself is very heavily based on stuff that has to do with stigma and identity and the things that you're talking about. How does that stuff play out in your experience, at least, in a new thought context?
So sex positivity is actually really focused on consent and exploration and advocating for exploration, because like you're saying, sexuality is on a spectrum for all of us. And if we walk around thinking that we can only fit into one box or another, we're not really getting to know ourselves. We're not really having an authentic expression of ourselves. And so the ways that we explore and that we're comfortable doing, that does deeply just impact who we are as human beings and where we want to travel on that spectrum and the conversations that we're engaging in, right? So it's not really, it is that spectrum. And it really is like, if we engage in exploration around anything, if we stay open and curious about our neighbors, about the world around us, then we're keeping our hearts and our minds open to a deeper, more authentic expression of life. And sex doesn't get to be the thing that's exempt from that. So that's where that overlap comes in. And sex positivity also, just for a side note, advocates things like comprehensive sex education in schools so that everyone can understand how their bodies work and how their partner's bodies work. You know, those basic things that many of us didn't learn until we were adults and possibly living with someone of a different gender, right? Or until we were exploring our own bodies. And then we really understood how it worked. So, so just in terms of like new thought context, is that what you were asking me?
Yeah.
Into question.
Like, how does that play out in a new thought? Like, what are the important footnotes about that dynamic that spiritual seekers who are new thought, who are either curious themselves or seeking to be greater members of society, who are allies to, or I don't want to say allies, but are, and I don't want to say tolerant either, people who are accepting of others, like what are the things that they need to know about how those dynamics play out in new thought that invite their faith to inform them how to deal with their inner struggles, whether it's with their own questions about their own sexuality or the things that come up in them when they encounter people who don't fit into their boxes?
Right. So I think that we don't get to draw the line between spirituality and sexuality anymore. I think that for so many of us, we grew up in traditions, or that's just been the experience where those things have to be separate. And the only experience that we've really seen about sexuality that's been acceptable, especially in a church community, are the heteronormative couples, you know, sort of standing on stage and saying, look at how wonderful our relationship and how spirit has informed this connection. And anyone who's been experiencing a connection other than that heteronormative, or not even necessarily a heteronormative, but that monogamous normative narrative that we're talking about, and saying, if I don't have that thing, if I don't have my person, then I'm somehow less spiritual. And that's not actually how this works. If we're exploring, if we're connecting, if we're interacting with other human beings, those interactions are valid. And in a new thought context, if we're talking about how we want to open our hearts and our minds to a deeper experience of life and love and spirit, then that means that we honor everyone's experience of how they're opening their hearts and their minds to a deeper experience of the divine, and understanding that that doesn't just look like a cookie cutter version of love and relationship. And we know that to be true because we're so accepting of the queer community and new thought. We know that to be true because we are working on being racially diverse and inclusive in our communities. At least we say we are.
And for the qualifier.
So when we say that we understand that honoring everyone's path to the one means that we really get to understand and create a space of understanding around everyone's path to the one, then that includes our entire experience of life.
Well, and it's important to say that as recently as the 90s, we were not
right.
with the LGBTQ community, right? And so I think sometimes people think, oh, we've always been down, and it's just not ever true. Like if a group of white people are telling you they've always been down, that is a thing you should not trust. But a couple of questions that arise from what you just said, which is really interesting. So you feel that deeply spiritual, intimate connections through sexuality can occur instantaneously, like this. So because what I heard you talking about was like, you know, that daydream of like, well, when you find the right one, when a mommy and a daddy fall in love and then they make sweet passionate love and their souls intertwine and they become one and all this kind of stuff, right? First, what is your relationship to that idea, right, that construct? And do you think that that's a thing that could happen among strangers? Do you think that's a thing that could happen instantaneously? Do you think that that's a thing that could be shared with many more people than simply one? And then the other piece that I want to ask about after that, so we got to put a pin in it, is, you know, you're not advocating that everyone should be exploring, you're advocating for safe exploration for all, right? So I want to talk about that. But first, so the spiritual, the concept of sexuality and sexual experiences with others as being a spiritual experience, that's not something that is in the confines of a monogamous relationship that like is God ordained or something.
Right. No, and I don't know. And I feel like that's societal. I don't know that that's necessarily ever come out of any sort of religious doctrine where we have to,
like cultural almost.
Right. And that has been ingrained in us because of the society we live in. And we could go back into history about, where the model for marriage came from and whether or not people were getting married to procreate and to create a workforce for their farms and like all that stuff. We could go back there, but we don't need to, because we understand that this model that we have seen in society is just that. It's a societal model. And then we started telling the fairy tales along the way that were, yes, we're going to be star-crossed.
Fairy tales.
and meet across a crowded room, and our eyes were going to meet, and then we were just going to know, and this person was going to complete us.
Like Alexander Hamilton and pretty much the entire Schuyler family.
Right. Right. all the stories that we've heard growing up about this fairy tale of what love is and how connection gets to happen, and it only gets to happen in the confines of, really, it's always, for the most part, been one man and one woman. And it's only until recently that we've been willing to open our hearts and minds to the understanding that that gets to happen with same-gendered couples or people who are identifying along a different sexuality and identity spectrum. So no, I don't actually think that a spiritual connection only happens when we have that moment where we've decided to spend the rest of our lives with each other. Because we're all adults and we've all lived in the real world a few years, and we all understand that relationship is much more complicated than that. And so by saying that that is the only valid experience of relationship, we are diminishing anyone else's experience of relationship that is not that.
Or possibly limiting our own.
And possibly limiting our own. And that doesn't feel good or healthy or like an authentic expression of not a damn thing in my mind, right? So when we're willing to understand that anyone's experience of relationship, what that looks like, is valid because it's their experience. And if I meet someone across a crowded room and we have a spiritual connection that is not even sexual in nature, and I understand that, and it's important to me, then that's really all that matters, is that it's important to me and that my experience gets to be valid.
Well, and you talked about consent too, right? Which is, my understanding is that for years now, there have been small groups that have tried to create sex positive spaces,
right,
that are built entirely on consent.
Yes.
So tell me about how would you advise someone who had some curiosity within themselves about their own sense of sexuality, and what spiritual things that they could be engaged in that would help them bring that authentic aspect of themselves into the forefront and provide them the faith and the confidence to maybe seek out those kind of positive spaces, or to begin to explore that aspect of their identity?
Okay. So I'm going to go back to that pin that we had on exploration, because I'm not advocating that everyone needs to go out and sleep with everyone else in order to understand their sexuality, right? Exploration within the context of consenting adults and doing what you want to do and what you feel good about and learning about yourself. So I would talk about sexuality in the way that I would talk about anything that we talk about in New Thought. And so any good that I desire for the world outside of me first has to start within. So if I'm willing to open my heart and my mind to a deeper exploration of love, a deeper exploration of relationship dynamics, a deeper exploration of sexuality, then guess who we get to hang out with first? It's us, right? Because I can go out and explore my body with all the people that I want to. But until I am like so deeply comfortable in my own body and with who I am and my own pleasure, then, some of that stuff is bumping around in the dark. And not that bumping around in the dark is also not a good time, because I will advocate that it can be a good time. All of the ways that we want to explore loving more deeply or having a deeper exploration of our sexuality is that willingness to go within and a willingness to connect with our own inner wisdom and our own connection with spirit, and then being moved from that space. And sex doesn't have to be separate from that. My intuition, my deep inner knowing, my relationship with spirit gets to come into whatever sexual exploration that I'm deciding to enter into.
So what do you say to the people that are like, well, that's a good excuse for everybody to just be whores?
Right.
right? Because I've had conversations where that's literally been the argument. It's like, that's all just an excuse to, satisfy every waking sexual fantasy that you have without, blah, 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 blah. So I'm sure you've heard some of that. Like, what is your response to that kind of stuff?
Well, I mean, the first question is, what's wrong with being a whore? Like, what's wrong with
What's up? Everybody
right?
loves a whore until they're mad at them.
Well, I mean, so I'm gonna go the step further. Like, sex work is valid work. Like, even if we wanted to go there, like, this work of providing sexual exploration and gratification to other human beings is actual valid work, and it's older than any of us. It's older than time. And so if we want to keep,
So what you're saying is that rich people have been having ladies beat the crap out of them for decades, for millennia.
well, rich people and
They're paying somebody for that thing they didn't want to tell nobody about.
right, like, sexual exploration and the commodifying of our bodies has been happening since the beginning of time.
And you don't believe that's connected to objectivity?
It is. And it doesn't invalidate the experience, right? Like, we can't just talk in spiritual circles about our positive experiences. We can't deny racism. We can't deny sexism. We can't deny all of these experiences that are actual lived experiences by human beings. And sex workers have been working since the creation of time, since before the creation of time. So we can't invalidate that experience.
I wonder what the first human was that was a woman or a man that was like, if I have sex with this other one, I can get that food.
Right. Or if I marry this one who's richer than me and I do the things that they want me to do in the bedroom, that's still commodifying sex. I know that one makes people really uncomfortable, but we commodify sex even in the context of committed monogamous relationship. So there's no way that we get to deny that happens in marriage and say that it happening outside of the context of marriage is a bad thing, because then it would be a bad thing everywhere. And maybe what we can do is just understand that these are valid lived experiences and that not one is better or worse than the other. So maybe it's an excuse for people to be whores or to explore their sexuality, but I don't actually viscerally in my body at all, when we're talking about authenticity and experiencing the divine, think that it's anyone's place to tell anyone else what is right or wrong for that individual. And I do think that new thought is something that wants to hammer that thought into our brains over and over again, because we do want to talk about honoring everyone's path and honoring everyone's experience. And sometimes someone's a whore, and sometimes someone commodifies their sexuality in the context of a monogamous marriage, and neither one is better or worse than the other. And sexual exploration happens for all of us. For some of us, it happens when we're drunken teenagers, when we're wild in our 20s. It doesn't happen until we get into a committed and monogamous relationship in our 30s. Wherever we feel comfortable exploring our sexuality, that's where we do it. But we're doing it. And if we keep denying that it's a part of our identity, then we're denying a part of our connection to the divine, because we're just denying a part of ourselves.
So I want to go back to the knocking around in the dark thing. Right?
Right.
In my personal experience, what I know is that stretching the boundaries of sexual behavior within a relationship among consenting adults is that just because the fantasy of doing a thing feels in your mind or has been programmed into your brain that it's supposed to be arousing, fulfilling, connective, great, doesn't necessarily mean that it will be.
Right.
And so I know many people who have chosen to stretch their boundaries and then had something that they didn't like occur in the process, and then it was like confirmation bias of everything that kept them from being curious in the first place and kind of shut them down. So how can people apply our philosophies to be able to address the idea that when they enter into the unknown, that they may not come out with what they had envisioned those experiences being, and how to care for ourselves if we build up the bravery to do the job and then find ourselves falling short of expectations or having a bad experience or something like that.
Cool. Okay, so you said it in your question. Apply the tools that we learn in this philosophy to your sexual exploration. So the first step comes and these two things no longer get to be two separate things. My spirituality and my sexuality no longer get to be two separate things. So all of the tools that I use to enhance my connection with spirit, to become a more spiritual being, to feel more enlightened, all of those tools actually get to be applied into every practice in my life, including sexuality. So if I am confused about something, I can go into prayer, I can meditate, I can center myself in the way that I would about any other thing that I'm wanting to explore in life, right? I want to explore a new job, I want to explore a new experience of something else. Then going back into this prayerful, meditative space and being willing to connect with my own connection, my own deep inner knowing, with my own version of spirit, that's going to go with me no matter where I go. And that even bumping around in the dark, spirit comes with me, because spirit and I are one, and we understand that. And when we understand that bumping around in the dark and sexuality is not separate from spirit, we can take those tools into that experience and that understanding. And I do want to go back to the idea of consent, because we keep going back to this word. We keep saying consensual, consent, consent, consent. And people really do frame that word only around the context of what happens in bedrooms and sexuality. And that's part of another disconnect that we need to sort of start, dismantling, because consent is something that we can teach ourselves, we can teach our children from day one. Things like body sovereignty and understanding that my body is my own to do with as I please. So when we teach our children they have to hug the creepy uncle or cousin that they don't want to, we're teaching our children to invalidate consent. We're teaching our children that they don't have sovereignty over their own bodies. And we all grew up with some sort of experience where, no, you're gonna hug that creepy person over there because I'm your adult. I'm the one in charge here, and your body is mine to tell you what to do with. So if we can just start to sort of take some of that apart and understand that all of the interactions that we have with people have to be consenting. And it's not just about sexual work or sexual labor or sexual interactions, but it's about emotional labor. It's about all the ways in which we connect with people. It's about when I, call up my sister or my husband because I'm having a bad day and checking in and saying, do you have the bandwidth to do this with me right now? That is getting their consent to engage in emotional interaction with me. So when we understand how consent works in all the areas of our lives, when we go into having a sexual interaction with someone, we will get to understand how exciting it is when someone not just gives us consent, but enthusiastic, fuck yes, hell yes, consent. And when we do that, some of that vision in our brains of this has to be this thing that I've painted this picture of, and it has to be exactly that, isn't as important as I have this really enthusiastic person in the room with me who is hell yes, I want to see you naked. Hell yes, I want to try this thing with you. And so bumping around in the dark gets to be something that we do with a consenting friend who's in it with us, versus I'm just going to take this preconceived notion of something into the room and expect someone to read my mind or project a fantasy onto someone that just isn't a reality. And that's not going to be enjoyable for either person in the room. And again, we can see that in a sexual context or not sexual context. I have this fantasy of this dream job and I'm going to project it onto this place. And when I go in and there are actual human beings who are doing actual human things and don't meet all of the fantasy expectations that I have in my brain, nobody's having a good time. So when we do sex that way, nobody's having a good time. But when we're both just yeah, I want to try that, hell yes, let's check it out, then everybody's having a good time, even if it doesn't meet the picture in our mind.
Well, I spent years working with teens who, oddly enough, love to talk about sex. And one of the things I used to say to them was, they'd get mad because I would say you have to have their consent, which is not a thing I knew as a teenager, by the way, right? I have been a man who has had to reflect on his sexual history and really acknowledge a bunch of places where I wasn't able, and literally call women and be like, hey, this might be awkward. I don't know. I just want you to know that if this was not consensual, that I've recognized it and that I apologize, and you don't owe me anything, and I don't want to re-harm you if I harmed you in the first place. And those have been I've had both ends of the spectrum. People that were you definitely fucking did not have permission to do that. And other folks who were nah, bro, that was good times. So what I tell them when they say, I tell them, I say, you got to get consent. And they're like, you mean I got to ask them if I can touch their boobs? And I'm like, yes. And they're like, I got to ask them if we can, you know, kiss. And I got to ask. And I'm like, yes. And the common complaint was always, well, but that would ruin the mood. And all I've said in those circumstances is, if asking for consent ruins the mood, then the mood is not what you thought it was.
Right.
Right? Like if someone wants it, asking them if it's okay to do it is not going to ruin the fact that they want it.
Right.
Right? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, and you just like, even just when I was talking about the differences just now, hell yes is way more exciting than like maybe, right? Yeah. Like who wants? And if maybe is what you're looking for, then you do need to go have a deeper conversation with yourself about.
Unless that's your thing and their thing too, but who knows?
Right. And then there's still a conversation about consent, right? So I think we see a lot of portrayals of like kinky sex or sex positivity or things on TV that make it look like it's perfectly acceptable for people to do things against their will. And I think many of us, especially our generation, grew up with this sort of portrayal of relationships in popular media where like even if a girl's saying no, she means yes, and it's your job to talk her into it. And I'm going to say that it also happens on the opposite side of the gender. Like even if there's a man who is, you know, a little shy or standoffish and you just have to seduce him or something, that is also not honoring consent and a little frightening. I don't want to say completely toxic, but it's pretty frightening, right? So I just think it's much more exciting to have someone go, hell yes, I'm in this with you. And it doesn't have to be like drawing a picture, can I do this, can I do that? But checking in with your partner and saying, is this okay?
Well, I'm going to give a little plug here because, you know, the media that we consume matters so much, right? And there's one piece of media that my wife and I found years ago that for us has really just been like a thing that we're committed to like continuing to consume from now on, because it challenges every aspect of our thinking and our belief system around sex and sexuality. And that is Dan Savage's Hump Festival. And so what he does, for those of you guys that don't know, is he has people submit homemade, basically pornographic films. But the point of the pornographic films is to convey aspects of sexuality in raw, authentic forms, without judgment. And then so what ends up happening is you go to this festival, and typically it's only something that you can see in person projected on a screen. This year they managed to pull it off and got consent from all of the people who submitted their videos, and they did an online streamed version. But really seeking out content that is deliberately challenging. Like there might be moments, I gotta be honest, there's moments where I gag, right? Like there's moments where I'm like, or I can't look away, or I have to look away. And then there's moments where I'm like, oh, does anybody know how horny this is making me? I don't know, right? And I think, again, being in that position, like being confronted with information and media that is taking a different perspective and addressing something different and acclimating ourselves to like that sense of confrontation, drawing the curious response out of us rather than the defensive one, or the one that I found most commonly in my pastoral care and counseling and in my own personal work and my own personal life. The thing that is not the curious thing isn't defensiveness, it's shame and guilt. Right? And like this idea that there's something shameful or some guilty thing, like, oh, I can't let anyone, like a sense of embarrassment of our authentic impulse, right? Which is not to say that we should be following every impulse, hence the consent focus, right? But the impulse is informative of what's going on in our consciousness, right? Like when we feel or sense or have that impulse, it doesn't mean we should be impulsive, but it does mean that that impulse is driven by some part of our conscious awareness. And it's our responsibility to like check in with that and what that is. So I encourage you all to like bookmark or go to the website and follow, you know, Dan Savage's Hump Festival. It is a hell of a lens into humanity. And it's great. It's great. Like I value it. Right? I don't enjoy everything that I end up having to see with my eyeballs, but I do value exposure to it so that I can say, well, these people chose to do that and they enjoy that. Man, my worldview is not the only worldview, especially around something so taboo historically in our culture, like sex.
And so, and what you're describing is a part of exploration, right? There's exploring our own bodies, there's exploring the bodies of our partners, and there's just sort of exploring our own inner thoughts and our psyche and understanding where that comes from. And I do think that it's important to understand the relationship between shame and sexuality, because we didn't come out of the womb feeling shame about our sexuality. We didn't come out as children. Like, we learned those things. We learned those things not only from the immediate authority figures in our lives, but from the society in which we're functioning. And so when we talk about, change your thinking, change your life, if we understand that someone ingrained these thoughts about sex and sexuality, and we're willing to explore how we feel about it ourselves, then that's a different conversation. It's shifting our perspective, and it's allowing us to create space for something other than our narrow view of the world, like you're talking about. And when we can do that for ourselves, then we can adequately do that for other people and create a safe space for people to understand that, it's okay to let go of some of that shame and guilt around just the fact that we are all sexual beings.
It's okay if creating a safe space is one in which there's an orgy occurring.
As long as everyone's consenting.
Everybody said yes. And yeah. It's so crazy. So I can't believe I'm having to admit this, but it's true. There was a woman in our church that I love to death, Bobby, and she gave us a CD of an artist, and I wish I could remember her name right now, but it's hilarious, and she makes children's music. And and the title of the album has the phrase "Smash the Patriarchy" in it, right? It's a children's album for that. And there's a children's song, and we were having my daughter listen to it heavily when she was younger. And one of the songs is "Only Yes Means Yes." Because I was raised with, if they don't say no, right? But like, for someone who had nothing to gain from that dynamic, right? I could see like the immediate reaction being weird. But for someone who had everything to gain from that dynamic, it was like, oh, that makes perfect sense. It's their job to tell me no if they don't want, and I'm just going to keep going, right? And then I'm not going to ruin the mood. And all these different fallacies of cultural influence that stacked up and layered themselves on top of each other, embedded themselves in there. And the only way to get through that stuff is not to pretend like it doesn't exist, but to confront it. And so taking in different forms of media helps, in my opinion, confront that kind of stuff. But to continue the theme of consent, so do you mind if I ask you some personal stuff about your journey in sex positivity personally?
Sure.
Okay. So at what point did you realize that there were curiosities that needed to be addressed and needed to authentically express themselves in ways that were outside of the norm? And what was your experience of that? And how did you begin moving into the curious exploration that you've talked about today?
Yeah, I don't know that I had a conscious sort of moment around that. I was in my 20s and exploring sexually, and I do think that for me there was spiritual awakening happening in the context of the bumping around in the dark and maybe not being very conscious about it. And then, to sort of then find my path into ministry and to be having a conversation with myself and my husband, who I've been with for 14 years, about what our relationship looked like. At the same time, we're sort of feeling pressure from the society in which we were living in a church community, and this narrative that was being taught about, the star-crossed love, and now it's the two of us, and now we're unstoppable, and not really feeling like that was an accurate portrayal of our relationship, nor did we want to sort of sell relationship in that way, because that's just not what our experience was. We did a lot of bumping around in the dark. We got married in our 20s. We were kids. We, a whole lot of things about our marriage were just let's be really honest about what our path has been together. And just as I've been honest about my path through spirituality, and it's not always butterflies and rainbows, right? We all know that our relationship with spirit also has some bumps and bruises and not some pretty moments. And so those things just all sort of coincided for me. If I'm going to have an authentic conversation about not only my path through spirituality, but my path through love and relationship, and then my path through sexuality and just life, then that's what I'm going to do. And I'm not going to start locking pieces of myself away in order to be an image of the cute perfect couple. And not that there's anything wrong with that. I mean, you and Kimmy are great. Like, perfect.
Don't you put us in a box, fucker. You don't know what's up.
Yeah, I don't know what you guys are doing behind closed doors. None of my business, right? But that's the thing, is that we have to give people room to do what they're going to do behind closed doors and know that they're okay. And know that the single people who I'm speaking to, who have an idea of what my relationship was like, really actually just get to hear the truth from me about what relationship and that experience is for me. And that your experience of not having that, or not having that until later in life, is just as valid as me getting married at 26, right? And that there's so much beauty and depth to be explored in everyone's experience of those things. So I'm just not afraid of sex. I think that's really what it is. I don't know that it was just like, oh, I'm going to talk about sex. It's just like, no, this is a part of the thing, of the whole thing for me. And if we're not talking about it, then we are completely just shutting off this whole experience of spirit and connection. And for me, connection is really where spirit lies. So I'm not going to deny.
So when you got conscious of it, when you started to become consciously aware of it,
yeah,
what was that, the experience of that revelation like?
I mean, lots of orgasms.
Well, fuck everybody. She's not going to tell you, but I will advocate. If it includes tons of orgasms, I encourage you to at least give it a shot.
I mean, when we're talking about just like mindfulness and consciousness, being mindful and aware and so comfortable in my body that nothing about it makes me uncomfortable, then a whole bunch of orgasms get to happen. Like, I don't know, you know?
Well, and so it's that mental block,
right?
That is put together the expectations, been indoctrinated by the society that has said, this is what that's supposed to look like. And then if it's not looking that way, then your brain has more authority in that moment than your sex organs really do sometimes, right? And that's a thing that as a man, I've definitely experienced, right? And there's the insane, ridiculous misogyny of like, the idea of a man's impotence making them an inferior human, when like, here's what I could tell you. And I don't know if there's any science on this, but if there is, we should find it, because the vast majority of men that find themselves dealing with more than one woman at a time have that problem. So like, the intensity of the mental aspect and the spiritual aspect of what's going on has like huge impact on the physical part. And then what we do is we get really judgmental about the physical part being broken, when in reality, it's just that it's not up to, like, something else is not aligned with what you're trying to get your physical body to do, right? So
men face that pressure differently than women. The anatomy is different. But
of course, I'm speaking from a stupid cis hetero guy kind of lens, right? So I apologize for that, but
no. But what we also advocate for surrender all the time in spiritual exploration, right? Like, we're talking about surrender. We're talking about letting go into the experience of being connected with the divine. And if there happens to be someone in the room who's helping to facilitate my connection with the divine, then that also facilitates our connection with each other. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the equipment all has to work the way that it works in those movies that we see with the, in the back rooms places, but a whole lot of other things that we get to explore, and a whole lot of ways of experiencing pleasure.
Do I make it hard to have this conversation, like giggling like a fucking 8th grader? Like, is that?
Just get it out of your system.
I just love it so much. Like, I'm so into the open, authentic, like talking about it, that when people finally do it, I'm like, ooh. Right? Because it's so non-commonplace. And because it's been my experience that sometimes the people who want to do that are taking it so seriously that I'm like, fuck. Like, yes, I get it. And no, I don't want to diminish anyone else's experience. But if we can't like enjoy the conversation about a thing that we think is supposed to be an embodiment of physical joy, then I'm probably not the one for that convo, right?
Yeah. I mean, and I totally geek out about sex, but let's just not forget about like any of the things that I geek out about. Like, it has to be fun. And the reason that we're so interested in sex is because it's fun. And if we can stop sort of feeling like we have to like hide behind whatever and giggle and be like, oh my God, this is so weird that we're talking about it, then it's still just fun. Like, there's not been weirdness between the two cis hetero people who, we don't have that kind of relationship, but we can still just sort of laugh and giggle and have a good time talking about sexual exploration, because it's just a part of our experience. It's just who we are as humans. And
it's literally a part of our bodies.
Right. And our bodies are the thing that we experience life through and God through. And so when we understand that everything we're experiencing in our bodies, like the sex is fun and can like even be a little bit shiny and glamorous to talk about, but everything that we get to experience of the world through these bodies is a part of our relationship with the divine.
Well, it's just so interesting because when I think about harm, which is really important, right? When we're having these conversations about cultural norms, a good portion of cultural norms have been born out of some point in time where we were avoiding some type of harm, right? Even the Bible is chock full of like, hey, don't eat that, it'll get you sick, right? Which today it'd be like, well, yeah, as long as you wash it and clean this part out, you're gonna be fine, right? But without that knowledge, that's a dangerous thing, right? And this idea that like, I refuse to believe that I think it's possible that it happens, right? So I don't want to rule out the idea that it happens because I think it does happen and by mistake. But I cannot possibly believe that more harm has been done by consenting adults engaging in any consensual sexual engagement whatsoever versus the harm that's been caused by denying people's sexual authenticities and affording them a culture where gaining consent and openly discussing consent and respecting differences has caused like the human psyche and our cultural psyche and our mass consciousness. What do you feel about the way that we can address the race consciousness, the mass consciousness stuff that's in there that is asserting itself when we are going to kind of that inner space where we confront our curiosity may come like immediately, like you said, the first place you go is to yourself. And when you go in there, like I said, sometimes the very first thing you start to encounter is shame or guilt, right? Especially when you become smarter, right? Because then you realize that the dumb version of you might have done some really terrible shit that you didn't even realize was terrible. And then that self-judgment, right? Because the culture has always been telling you that people that do that are terrible, and then suddenly you're that, right? So what would be your like anecdotal prescription for, look, when you're going to go do this curious inner work and you come upon those things that are really barriers between the race consciousness and what it's taught you and what it is you're trying to seek knowledge about, what would you invite people to keep in mind or to consider when they're undergoing that kind of self-exploration?
Yeah, and I don't think that it would be really any different than the clients that I've had who are engaging in self-exploration or in a deeper connection with spirit. That's not about sex, really, right? It's that we've all had those moments, I think, along our spiritual path. And if you haven't, please email me and let me know. But I think we've all had those moments where it's just like, oh my God, I was the asshole, right? Like, I think it's Reddit. Yeah, I think it's like Reddit who does those things like, am I the asshole? Like, and they ask people, am I the asshole? Like in our sexual exploration or in our spiritual exploration, we go, oh my God, I was the asshole. In that moment, that was me. And we have to sort of face that moment of reckoning with ourselves of just like, oh shit, right? Like I am the bad guy in someone else's narrative. And we get to also just come to peace with sometimes we're the bad guy in someone else's narrative. And sometimes it's also just completely justified. And I was a kid and I had all of this societal shit put on me about, sit still, keep your legs closed, don't say anything because you're a girl. And then like all of the times that I didn't do that I didn't just keep my mouth shut, that I wasn't just like demure and ladylike. Like I still make jokes. I'll accidentally like flash my partner when I'm getting in the car or something like, oh my God, that was so ladylike. And they're not complaining. I don't know why I'm just like, oh, shame and guilt all of a sudden because you've been flashed by my dress being open. And it's like, we get to explore that. We get to take all of these tools that we have learned in our spiritual exploration into our human expression in the world, our sexual expression in the world, and honor all the places where, yes, you were the asshole. Yes, you could have done that better, but you didn't know better, so you didn't do better. And now that you know better, what are you going to do? And now that you know that you need to ask questions, that you need to look around, that you need to do research, are you going to take the opportunity to stay curious and open and not judge yourself or anyone else based on what is outdated information? And that outdated information probably did come from a world that was trying to keep us safe and did come from people in our lives who loved us, who are also trying to keep us safe. But as adults, consenting adults, when we're learning, we learn, we stay open, we stay curious, we find the information, we talk with our partners so that I don't have to go back to this moment in time 10 years from now and go, oh my God, I was the asshole again. It's probably still going to happen, but hopefully a little bit less.
Well, maybe with some grace, right?
And a little less damage.
In Oneness New Thought, the virtue of truth is about the acceptance of facts with divine grace, right? And like, okay, well, that's not a thing that's going to change just because I pretend like it doesn't exist.
Right.
And I don't want to beat myself up over it for the next millennia. So taking responsibility and accountability for it is very different than beating oneself up for it forever and ever. And so right. I think this is what's funny is that like the crux of what we've discussed today is pretty much, yeah, treat sex like everything else.
Right. I mean, I think
from a spiritual
thing is like, stop denying it as a part of your experience, right? I get it. Like, I grew up Catholic. I get that we were taught that our bodies were somehow not holy and not part of spirit and not part of God. But that's just absolute bullshit. And that's the only reason that not the only reason, but it's one of the main reasons I keep talking about this, because it's just absolute bullshit to deny any part of our experience as a part of the divine. Like, spirit loved us into being to experience this thing called life for it. So I'm going to do it, and I'm going to have a lot of orgasms while I'm doing it.
Please.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Well, and
yeah. And thank you for letting me have all those orgasms. Sure. Thanks, God. Thank you. Thank you, God.
God bless you. God bless me. God bless it. God bless all of them.
Yeah.
Right. And procreation is the making of love.
Right.
And so God loves so much that it procreates, and what it procreates is it makes us.
Right.
And so that is an act of making love. And so I think it's really powerful that we distinguish sex from love, but that we understand that love can't be distinguished from anything.
Right.
Because love is everything. Love's all there is, right? And so just to wrap up, in the work that you're doing, and when you're going out and speaking, and when you're kind of having to compartmentalize yourself a little bit because of those cultural pressures, right? Like how you speak when you're in certain contexts versus how you speak in other contexts about what topics. For you, what does it mean to use context to maintain a balance of the idea that while it's okay for you to be really deeply engaged in this conversation and this work, that's not necessarily something everyone else is consenting to engage in and participate in? And how do you balance the fact that you serve as a spiritual leader and that part of your ministry is about a topic or an item or a subject matter that not everyone is going to want to opt into?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think consent is a really big part of that. So understanding that I am a spiritual leader, that I am a minister, that I've had a pulpit ministry for, where are we at now? 7 years. So I do speak about new thought and all of these concepts, and I've not been talking about sex for the last 7 years. And if you invite me to speak at your community, I'm not going to be like, yes, let's talk about orgasms.
And I'm not going to show up as It's Really Real unless you ask me to. So samesies, I'm not going to come fuck, shit, piss, tits all over your pulpit, I promise. Unless, of course, that's what you're into. And then if you're consenting, great, I'll come. You can pay me for that.
So, and that's really like, when I've spoken about sex, that is, has come with warnings to the audience, and you might not want to bring your kids under a certain age unless you're prepared to hear Amanda talk about sex and say the word orgasm a lot. Like, that's really, thank you, Reverend Amani Malaika and the Albuquerque Center for Spiritual Living, for giving me the opportunity to just have a really great conversation with folks about pleasure. And I also do that on my podcast, on the Poly Priestess podcast, and that's where that's been focused. And for clients who want to come and have these conversations about their relationship style or their ways of connecting with the world, understanding that there is a safe space in my ministry to have a conversation about, where spirituality and sexuality and love all coincide. And as far as when I stand up on a pulpit and I speak on a Sunday, then you're getting me. You're getting an authentic expression of who I am. So I might curse, but I'm also going to be like just this smiling, giggling, laughing, enjoying life person, and I enjoy all of life. And so I think that just sort of is apparent. And I don't have to say on stages, I have all the orgasms and that's why I'm in such a good mood. Right? Like, I'm always, I don't know
what your tally is for the day, but I'm pretty sure I'm in the lead.
What time is it? Wait, so And I think that that's just really it. Like, my ministry is my life. And I've also just sort of really taken that really seriously. Like, I just understand that my ability to love my life and love my work and love the people that I interact with in all of the appropriate ways was what I'm doing. And so it's just a part of my work. It's not just like, it's a part of me, but it's not who I am in totality. And it's not what my ministry is in totality. So.
Cool. Well, with that in mind, it's a perfect segue. Amanda, Reverend Amanda Ganley, will you please tell these people how they can go and consume some safe, positive content about their spirituality and their sexuality?
I will do that. So I have a social media presence as the Poly Priestess. So you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok as Poly Priestess, P-O-L-Y, Priestess. You can also find me. You can find me at polypriestess.com. I have a podcast that is in all the cool places where podcasts are. So the iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio.
I don't even have that shit yet.
Okay, so I'm on all those places. I think we're up to about 27 episodes right now. I have a YouTube channel that's Poly Priestess. And if you're looking for a little bit more of a tang dip in the pool, you just want to dip your toe in, you can find me as Rev Amanda Ganley on Facebook and Instagram as well, and amandaganley.com.
Awesome. Amanda, our friendship has been the strangest, most fun and painfully agonizing and joyfully ridiculous, journey. I just have to say that. And I'm so grateful that you said yes to coming on and talking about something that I don't think enough people are talking about, and doing it in a way that is so, I don't know how to describe what I sense from it, but there's not like an authoritative, dominant voice. Sometimes when you listen to people that talk really adamantly about sexuality, they're very like, look, we should be allowed to talk about this stuff. And you don't have that. You have this bubbly, nurturing, receptive, judgment-free energy about you that I just love to death. And so if you guys are looking for a safe place to go and have those conversations, and I know Amanda provides pastoral counseling and all of that kind of stuff, and you're looking for someone that has that, I really encourage you to definitely check out all of her stuff and maybe put something together. And so what I like to do at the end of these is really just let the guest have the last word. So now that we know what we've heard about you, we've heard from you, and we know where to find you, I just want you to tell the people who see this conversation, what's one thing that you think you'd really just like to leave them with before we end this conversation?
Cool. So thank you for being the cis hetero white guy who will, let me call you out on your privilege every now and then and still keep laughing about it. So thanks for that, Brian. Excruciating, so at times, friendship. I heard you.
No,
yeah. And as for everyone who's listening, I really think that our path to a deeper understanding of life and a deeper connection with our higher power is to be the most authentic representation of who we are on this world, and honoring everything about our experience here. And that's what I'm seeking to do, is just create spaces where people understand that they are safe, they are honored, they are valid, and they are loved for being the most authentic, beautiful expression of the divine that they've come here to be. And that's what I love about my work. So, yeah.
And so it is.
And so it is.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Reverend. And you know what? I would be remiss if I didn't ask for this. So if you would be so kind as to give us an affirmative prayer to just end the whole thing on that perfect positive note. Would you be into that?
Sure. I'm happy to do that. So
Awesome.
I'm just going to take a note out of your book and invite you to join me in this affirmative prayer. And we will take a deep breath. Close your eyes if you feel comfortable and settle into your physical space. Feel that open-hearted space at the center of your being soften just a little bit more, because we are softening into the awareness that there is one power and one presence, that there is one divine grace and one perfect love, that perfect love is living and moving and having its being in, through, and as myself, in, through, and as everyone who is listening and participating with us, that perfect love is operating in, through, and as all of life as it surrounds us. So all of the noise outside of our doors, everyone that we have interacted with today, and in every interaction, grace and spirit and love have been present there. So it's in this space that we honor and recognize that spirit is present in every single thing that we are, and everything that we do, and in every encounter that we have. And we know that it's unfolding in perfection. So we allow that unfolding to continue. Whether it feels comfortable or uncomfortable, we know that we are honoring spirit by being present to it, by opening our hearts and our minds to it, and by letting go into these experiences, into our hearts, and into our connections. And as we let go, we know that we are deepening in our connection. We are experiencing love in only the way that we can experience love, and we call it good. We call it blessed. We call it perfect. And so I give thanks. I give thanks for this moment. I give thanks for this sacred time that we have set aside to be together today. And I give thanks for Reverend Brian and his ministry. I give thanks for my ministry as it continues to unfold and blossom, and for all of the love that is present in this conversation and in our lives. I say thank you, Spirit. I say thank you, life. And I let it be. And so it is.
And so it is. Amen. Reverend Amanda Ganley, everyone, thank you again so much. I love and appreciate you. And we look forward to doing another one of these sometime in the future, yeah?
Yep, it'll be good times.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Peace. What up? Reverend Brian here again. And this is the end of the video where I ask you, if you like this content, like and share it. And if you subscribe to it, that would be amazing. And most importantly, if you want to be notified every time I upload a new video, just click that bell and YouTube will make sure that you never miss a single one. Thank you so much for supporting my work. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. And I'm just knowing that something amazing is unfolding in your life right now. Peace. All right, it can be kind of jolting, the intro, so I apologize.
Okay, I'll try to compose myself.
All right, you ready? It's funny because sometimes I get people like, okay, cool. Here we go. Let me get this out of the way. Okay. What up? Reverend Brian Akers here, and this is It's Really Real. And today we're having a conversation with Reverend Amanda Ganley.